So this will be the first of a pair of sermons that use old silent movies as a lens into our cultural history. If critical race theory is analysis of how racism is embedded in our nation's legal structure, I use film to explore cultural attitudes that are embedded in the history of movies. Racism, of course, is not the only cultural attitude we can analyze by looking at old movies, but it is sure one of them. And that's what I'll be looking at today. We can learn a lot about what makes any society tick by watching its old movies. One fascinating aspect is that old movies show us attitudes the director and crew and even the audience may not even have known they had, but which stick out like sore thumbs when we look back at them 50 or 100 years later. And that includes our deep cultural roots in racism and patriarchalism. The older the movie, the more we see truly cringe-inducing attitudes. I will mention one scholarly theory about film that's important when you're talking about old directors or new ones, what's called auteur theory, from the French meaning author, A-U-T-E-R, E-U-R, auteur. Auteur theory holds that major directors, the Steven Spielberg, Stanley Kubrick's, Francis Ford Coppola's, and so on, each tend to have a distinctive style so that you can analyze one director's work for common themes that flow through the course of that director's career. And this certainly applies to America's first truly great film director, D.W. Griffith. He began directing movies in 1908, was one of the founders of the Hollywood filmmaking industry, and he did more than anyone else to set the standard for what we now see as the Hollywood blockbuster movie. He created the vocabulary that filmmakers still use, the visual vocabulary. Before Griffith, the earliest movies looked like theater plays, with the camera taking the place of the audience. But Griffith began to move the camera, as you saw in the clip. Silent film innovations such as camera cranes, tracking shots, the dolly, the pan, camera angles, intercut chase scenes, rescue scenes, a great many tropes that we now take for granted, all evolved by way of D.W. Griffith. He also developed film editing. Depending on how you splice different shots together, the same basic collection of film or video can tell radically different stories and create radically different effects. And when someone talks about the director's cut of a movie, that's what they're talking about. And we take that for granted now. But such techniques were revolutionary in the early 1900s, and yet, as film critic Roger Ebert noted, Griffith used his genius to push the worst kind of violent racial bigotry without ever realizing how bigoted he actually was. Southern-born, he never questioned his own racial assumptions, nor did most other white people. The whole country was nearly as prejudiced as he was. And I don't believe Griffith himself ever fully understood the social and emotional powers with which he was so skillfully and yet heedlessly playing. Flawed though our own times are, it's easy to forget how all-encompassing patriarchalism and racial prejudice were 100 years ago. Griffith and most of his audiences saw non-European or even Eastern European or Southern European races as inferior. Men were strong and women were dependent, silly, sometimes dangerous. People with disabilities were invariably objects of pity or ridicule, as was anyone who didn't fit into a standard heteronormative gender mold. Griffith's 1915 Civil War epic, The Birth of a Nation, is a study in the power of film. As entertainment, it was years ahead of its time. Studios in 1915 were nervous whether an audience would even watch a film for more than a half hour. The Birth of a Nation and Griffith's follow-up epic, the one we saw the clip from, Intolerance, ran more than 3 hours each, and audiences flocked to see them. But to the modern viewer, the most striking feature of The Birth of a Nation, beyond epic Civil War battle scenes, which are still quite remarkable, and dated silent film techniques, is its mind-boggling racism. All black speaking roles were played by white actors in ludicrous blackface makeup. Time and again, Griffith portrayed black men lusting after white women. But society's paranoia about black sexuality was so great, those scenes could only have been filmed with unmistakably white men wearing blackface makeup. And if you wonder why blacks are still very touchy, or other ethnicity are very touchy about blackface and that kind of makeup, that's part of the reason. It was always used to degrade people. Even as it was, white men in blackface makeup, the movie so angered white audiences that they often went on to attack innocent black citizens and destroy black-owned property. Harvard economics professor Desmond Ang surveyed old newspapers and found a 5-fold increase in lynchings right after The Birth of a Nation played in a town, particularly small towns. He did try that in a small town, and that's what would happen. In Griffith's version of the post-Civil War era, black Union soldiers occupy the defeated South. All the Union soldiers are black. Freed blacks take over the southern state legislatures and enact laws to oppress white citizens. And the depictions of the black lawmakers are most remarkable because they're so grotesque. The defeated Southern menfolk, meanwhile, are reduced to passivity until, as Griffith tells us in an intertitle, quote, "The Ku Klux Klan became the organization that saved the South from the anarchy of black rule." Now, of course, if you think we've done away with that kind of racism completely, listen to a white supremacist talk about what they're now calling replacement theory. The post-Civil War Ku Klux Klan had faded away after about 1880 and was almost non-existent when The Birth of a Nation came out. But with Griffith's box office hit as a recruiting tool, Klan membership skyrocketed. By 1925, within 10 years, more than 5 million men across the Midwest and South had joined the Klan. 5 million new members, with a women's auxiliary of nearly 100,000. Ironically, the bigotry across American society was so huge as to render it invisible. The Birth of a Nation broke all box office records and was the first movie specifically shown by demand at the White House. And it should not be surprising that it won raves from White House staff, including Virginia-born President Woodrow Wilson. And the movie's racism may seem disgusting now, but it bothered few white people at the time. In response to violence generated by The Birth of a Nation, the newly formed NAACP criticized it harshly, and this kills me. Griffith responded with an angry 45-page self-published pamphlet titled "The Rise and Fall of Free Speech in America." He complained, because he was criticized, he complained that his freedom of artistic expression was being censored. Mind you, The Birth of a Nation was the most profitable film ever made. It remained the top grossing film in history until long after Griffith died. Gone with the Wind was re-released in 1961. I was 11 years old, and at that time, The Birth of a Nation was still the top grossing motion picture of all time in 1961. In Griffith's day, black people were not even allowed to sit with white movie audiences, and of course, black people could and did suffer severe beatings just for setting foot on a white beach or drinking from a white drinking fountain. And yet, D.W. Griffith felt persecuted and censored. Those were the words he used because a few people, mostly blacks, didn't like his movie. And for the record, gang, that is how white fragility works. His pamphlet starts out all in capital letters. Why censor the motion picture, the laboring man's university? He then adds, the motion picture can carry the truths of history to the entire world without cost, while at the same time bringing diversion to the masses, as the cheerless existence of millions would be brightened by this new art. Two of the chief causes of war would be removed. The motion picture is war's greatest antidote. Close quote. And in addition to those accusations of censorship, he then concludes, if I approach success in what I am trying to do in my coming picture, Intolerance, the one we saw the clip from, I expect a persecution even greater than that which met The Birth of a Nation. Now this was and is patent baloney. It is striking how much self-pity a successful white businessman could show responding to any criticism by saying that he was the one being persecuted and censored. So, that is what white fragility looked like in 1915. And we must reflect that in 100 years since, the degree of racism has certainly changed in America. It's gotten a lot better. As ongoing reports on racialized police violence across the nation show, however, racism is still with us. But white responses, when privilege gets challenged, have really changed very little. The level of defensiveness, silly though it can be sometimes when viewed from a distance, is still with us. White fragility is nothing new, just the term for it is new. And some film critics and historians, Roger Ebert included, have suggested that Griffith made his next epic, Intolerance, as a kind of apology for The Birth of a Nation. Now, if Griffith's pamphlet isn't enough to prove otherwise, the opening scenes of Intolerance do prove that he did not make it as an apology. Griffith's message right from the beginning of that movie is that society's problems do not rise from, say, racial intolerance or Jim Crow or even slavery. The real troublemakers were the uplifters, as he called them, self-satisfied, power-hungry do-gooders, the woke, to use today's term, who trigger injustice, death, and destruction in a but-for-them happy world. Now, Griffith's use of that language is deeply problematic. Black intellectuals, from George Washington Carver to W.E.B. Du Bois, advocated what they often termed racial uplift, that blacks who gained some position in society should use their relative advantage to uplift their struggling siblings of color. They had different opinions on how black people might gain more equality. Carver and Du Bois and the black intellectuals who ranged between them disagreed on many points. But the word uplift was important to both of them. So it's an important term, and it is therefore highly unlikely that Griffith could have been unaware of that term in racial discussions of his day. And he either didn't know and didn't care, which condemns him as willfully ignorant, or he did know and chose to ridicule the very idea, which condemns him as willfully racist. Either way, he had no regard for black hopes, black hopes and aspirations. A few years later, I kept mentioning to the kids how Griffith kept making the same movie over and over again with, excitement and action, people getting killed, and then a rescue scene. Okay. A few years later, President Wilson commissioned Griffith to make a propaganda film to support the United States' entry into the First World War. All of this stuff was going on while World War I was happening. Griffith traveled to Europe and basically reshot The Birth of a Nation, set this time on the Belgian-French border. Germans became the bloody villains instead of black Yankee soldiers, and the French were the heroes. And in the end, instead of the Ku Klux Klan riding to the rescue, it was French cavalry, and he called this film Hearts of the World. All movies by this time, the U.S. had gotten into the war, all movies by this time were subject to cuts by wartime censors, wartime censorship. Griffith didn't complain about that. That was okay. He did, however, get his film registered, not in his own name or even in the name of his production company, but as a product of the War Office, the Defense Department of that day. As such, any criticism of his movie could be prosecuted under federal anti-sedition statutes. So much for Griffith's championship of free speech. Situational ethics, gang. And I include these details partly because in our own time, many people on the right, as well as a few Unitarian Universalists, when criticized for insensitivity toward marginalized identities, go, you might say, full Griffith, accusing their detractors of political correctness run amok, safetyism, cancel culture, censorship, persecution, and being too woke. Both The Birth of a Nation and Hearts of the World inspired real hatred toward real people. And it's also worth noting that only a year or so after he had claimed that movies were war's greatest antidote, Griffith had turned around and made a movie that forcefully promoted war. Situational ethics. To Griffith's chagrin, however, President Wilson rejected Hearts of the World. He hated it because it portrayed Germans as such monsters. It was bad for the peaceful and just settlement Wilson sought in post-war negotiations. Portraying American blacks as oversexed animals was one thing. Doing the same to Germans while the president was trying to lead international diplomacy was quite another. And yet, white actors and set crews who worked with Griffith insist that he was not unkind and he was not intentionally racist. He was, they said, sympathetic to good blacks, failing to understand that to him, black goodness could only come through black servility. The profound evil of Griffith's bigotry and that of his society lay not in his intent, but in the effect on those he harmed. Good intentions did not reduce the death toll, as Professor Eng's work shows us. His movie got people killed. It got houses burned. Marginalization still plays out in real-world violence and economic disadvantage, even to our own day. And the evil, therefore, lies not in the intent, but in the effect on those who are belittled or degraded, however innocently. So this calls us to confront what we haven't learned since Griffith's day and the necessary discomfort of having our own acceptance of or even occasional participation in today's injustices challenged. it's always more comfortable to look away, which might explain why film historians to this day so often detail the birth of a nation's innovations while glossing over its jaw-dropping racism, even now. But if we summon the courage to face the multi-layered ugliness of homophobia, transphobia, patriarchalism, and white supremacy culture, and how we ourselves can participate in them. If I face my own discomfort, and you face yours, I believe we truly do begin to make that discomfort into something sacred. We do not make the world a better place or become better people ourselves by staying in our comfort zones. 100 years after the birth of a nation was setting box office records, we can look back now and see its evil in full view. It's worth bearing in mind that 100 years from now, people will be looking back at us, and it's up to us what they will see. Blessed be, and amen.